So I'm Amber Hewett. I'm the Offshore Wind Energy Program Director with the National Wildlife Federation. I'm based in Massachusetts, and I've been working with NWF for a little over 10 years now, building out our offshore wind advocacy program. And our work is really twofold. We advocate for the market building policies necessary to establish an offshore wind industry as a climate solution. But the other half of our work is defining and advocating for recommendations that can ensure that wildlife and habitat are protected throughout every stage of development. So in that part of my work, which I think those two pillars used to be more balanced than they are, and as we move toward a larger scale of offshore wind development at a faster pace, we're spending a lot more time trying to figure out how to meet our standards of responsible development, and truly, if that is possible at the pace and scale that the Biden administration has committed to. So I have been very much looking forward to this symposium since even before I was invited to moderate a panel. I am here, to be very clear, as a student of the topic to learn from the experts that are to my left, and those we'll be hearing from throughout the day. So we are going to be spending this next hour or so building on the concepts and definitions and perspectives that we heard yesterday, and talking about why to do the work of applying and advancing NPI within offshore wind. So I know much of the rest of the day will be about sort of the how of the mechanics behind what we can do to make this work, what our options are in that regard. But this morning for this session, we're going to just take a moment to do a bit of case making, not with any case in mind, but just sort of getting a sense of what the case for this is, both from the perspectives of the potential benefits to the environment and to species and habitat, but also why else we might do this. What are the other drivers, the policy, corporate, and financial drivers as well? So to walk us through that, we'll first be hearing from Boze Hancock. Boze is the senior marine restoration scientist with the Nature Conservancy, who will be bringing both perspectives on both US and global projects. We will hear virtually from Laura Harland. She'll be joining us remotely from the UK. She is the Marine Net Gain Team Leader for the UK Department of Environment and Fisheries and Rural Affairs. So she'll be providing us with a government's perspective on these environmental improvement opportunities within offshore wind. We will then shift to hear from two speakers with the developer's perspective. So we'll first hear from Atma Khalsa, an environmental affairs manager with Avangrid. In addition to speaking to the developer's perspective, Atma will be providing perspective and experience on World Bank requirements. And then we'll hear from Rennie Meyers, the Senior Public Affairs Advisor for Oceans and Biodiversity with Ørsted. And finally, we'll wrap up with a presentation from Drew Carey, Vice President of Americas at Venterra, who will be bringing both the consultant and science perspective. So we'll kick it off with Boze and look forward to having a discussion amongst panelists and then hearing some questions from all of you at the wrap-up.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to see everybody at least looking so bright-eyed and bushy-tailed at this time of day. Thanks very much. So what I would like to be chatting to you about really comes from the perspective of my involvement in this field, which is restoration. So marine habitat restoration. And one of the things that I need to point out, I guess, is that I bring a perspective from a lot of my life spent underwater. So the birds we heard about yesterday, I can't claim to be a bird expert. I think we've had some excellent information on the intersections with birds and bird habitats. I think and kind of live in the underwater realm. So marine habitats, and I've been putting them back together, or trying to, for about 20 years. I'll be talking about the critical coastal habitats. So I'll run quickly through what are they, why are they critical, and how does that fit into offshore wind. But just listening yesterday and thinking about some of the words that are being used, it strikes me that, get the right button. It strikes me that the restoration community has been talking and thinking for a long time about ecosystem services. Now, I've personally spent a lot of time trying to quantify ecosystem services. What is the fish production? What is the nutrient mitigation value of some of these habitats? What's the shoreline protection value? That, I think, is what the offshore wind language is net positive impact. I thought it was worth pointing out to start with that I get the strong feeling that these are just two different communities that have developed with slightly different languages that mean exactly the same thing. So thinking about that as we move forward. But with critical coastal habitats, what are they? The vegetated habitats, there are basically 6 of these critical coastal habitats, 4 vegetated: the salt marsh, seagrass, mangroves and giant kelps. And then the reef habitats, the coral reef and shellfish reef. And these are ecologically equivalent. The coral reefs dominate in the tropics. The shellfish reefs take over that reef-forming function, or should take over that reef-forming function in higher latitudes, but they're essentially gone, particularly the oyster reefs, because they're a fishery and they were fished out many years ago. But in terms of restoring some of these habitats, we know quite a bit about the shellfish reefs, been working with them for a long time. We've got runs on the board, know how to do it, so I'll be using those as an example. Excuse me. And I'll also be talking a little bit about North Sea and Europe, UK kind of geography, so just queuing that up. But why are these critical? Critical really for 2 reasons. These are all the biogenic habitats, and they create structure. They create structure in the ocean for us. And most of that structure is gone. It's gone because, since the agricultural revolution for hundreds of years, we've been tilling soil and in effect pouring a lot of mud into our nearshore environments. We've got an enormous amount of soft sediment, an overabundance of mud. The other impact in the further offshore area is the bottom fishing, trawling. A lot of that biogenic structure has just been ripped out, it's been mowed down. So the structural component of some of these biogenic habitats is really important. The other part of the kind of importance of these is productivity. These habitats are far more productive than anything that doesn't have that biological growing component. Easiest to describe with some of the shellfish reefs, particularly the bivalves, they're filter feeders. They are, through making a living, grabbing all of the stuff that's in the water column and not available to most of the critters in the reef, and packaging that up as biodeposits and feeding it into that 3-dimensional structure. So this is actually feeding the biodiversity, feeding the community in that reef. That pelagic benthic coupling makes them really, really important. And they are habitats. I talk a lot about oysters, but it's not actually the oysters that are important. It's the habitat that creates. And the other stuff, the other biodiversity that lives on that reef is just as important. You can see the photo on the right, there's all sorts of things in there. A lot of the sponges, ascidians, bryozoans, they're all filter feeders, and they are all adding to that pelagic benthic coupling function of that structure. It's what makes artificial reef work, not as well as a filter feeding reef, but an artificial reef or a rocky reef is actually the substrate, the structure that actually hosts all of that biodiversity. So what does it look like? We were talking yesterday about what are the monitoring metrics, what are the metrics that might be useful here. And this table here, sorry, these are the only data. I've got 2 data points, it's not going to be much. But here we have a list of fairly high order taxonomies. It's kind of amphipods, barnacles, shrimp, those kind of high groupings. That's your biodiversity. The length of that list is your species groups. But what's important, I think, here is these 2 columns. This is the unrestored habitat, so your control habitat, it's basically mud or sand, subtidal mud or sand. This is your restored measure. This comes from subtidal oyster reef. You don't have to worry about the numbers. You just run your eye down these, and there's kind of a 1 to 3 order of magnitude increase in abundance. and similarly 1 to 3 order of magnitude increase in biomass associated with those habitats. So the biodiversity may not be the best measure, but this productivity, I think, is pretty critical. And this graph is just a subset of that biodiversity. These are the fish. And these are the fish that are produced from 1 hectare of oyster reef in the Atlantic coast of the US every year. So on the y-axis here, these translate to tonnes per hectare, so 1, 2, 3 tonnes per hectare per year of new fish coming off oyster reef. And it's new fish because this is entirely based on the increased survival of the babies. As Chris Maguire last night was saying, think of this in terms of compound interest. If you look after the babies, the impact of that smallest and most abundant year class compounds, it's far more effective than looking after the adults because there are far fewer of them. It's also an underestimate because it's only based on the juvenile survival, but this actually, oh, sorry, wrong button again. It's kind of a few points here. 3 tonnes per hectare is an enormous amount. This is additional fish. It is the only method I know of at this point where we've separated production from attraction. One of the big arguments with most of this fish work is, yeah, but you stick structure in the water and it attracts fish. They all come in because there's structure there. And it's true. But this is actually looking at additional production. You start by subtracting the number of juveniles you've got on your control habitat from the number that you see on the reef, and then work with the extra babies that are surviving on the reef. So it's quite an impact. So if I'm talking shellfish reef as an example, I'll be talking a bit about the North Sea as an example. What does oyster reef restoration look like? We start by adding to the sea floor that reef structure. You need to build some structure underneath it. It's usually shell or rock. Shell is a limiting resource. Rock's a much easier substrate to take to scale, to actually get to the kind of scale we need to be working at. I advocate for limestone. It seems to work pretty well. Granite is essentially just as good. That gets quarried, it gets loaded onto some fairly heavy equipment, and this is a glorious day in South Australia, building part of what is a 20 hectare oyster reef, Venterra reef in South Australia. Now that kind of operation probably, I hope, reminds everybody here of offshore wind, and there is a lot of this rock being used in the offshore wind industry. The scour protection around each of those pylons is exactly that same kind of grade of rock, and the rock armouring that goes over all of the sea floor infrastructure, the cabling, the junction points. The offshore wind industry, in my view, is in effect already doing the most expensive and industrial scale part of shellfish reef restoration. So we stick the substrate out and build a reef base, then we need to add the biology. Most of these places that we're talking about, there aren't enough oysters left to actually be providing the larvae to recruit to hard substrate even if you put it there, so you need to build the breeding populations. These are tanks at the Horn Point lab, Eastern Shore, Maryland. This is the biggest operation in the US at the moment, and these are the larval rearing tanks. They are a serious size. That's the inside of one of them. That volume of water will produce hundreds of millions of larvae for each run. Those larvae then get drained down, transported, they actually get stored, they stick them in a fridge, and can accumulate the millions of larvae that are needed for the remote setting process by slowing down the early developers and waiting for the late developers to catch up. Those larvae then get taken out to this dock. There are 23 of these setting tanks on a dock. Each of those tanks has cages of oyster shell. Those larvae are set onto oyster shell to make them a manageable unit. And those cages, once the larvae are set, this crane will come down and pick them up, spill them straight onto the deck of this boat. trip a trapdoor at the bottom of each cage, spill that oyster shell out onto the deck, the boat goes out and puts them on a restoration site. It's a reasonably smooth operation. But I want you to remember this image. I'll probably come back to it, because that is a picture I have in my mind for the North Sea. And the reason that I'm thinking about that is, I hope described by these two charts. This one on the left is actually a chart of the oyster reef areas according to Olsen in 1883. This survey was done because of concerns of overfishing in the North Sea oyster fisheries in 1883. Basically because steam engines had gone into the dredge boats in the 1860s. So this became an industrial mining operation, just dredging things out. But the chart on the right is probably aging now. We've all noted this is an incredibly fast-moving field, but these are the either permitted or planned offshore wind areas for the North Sea. And have a look at the overlap here. It's pretty immediately obvious that there's a large overlap between where Oyster Reef was and where the offshore wind is going. And the other point here is that, I've described how productive Oyster Reef is as a habitat. And look at it, the North Sea used to be about 20% oyster reef. It's incredible. So we're operating in the same area, site selection isn't a problem, and the offshore wind industry is already doing, without kind of realising it, well, they do actually, the offshore wind industry has been doing this for several years. I've been chatting to them for a long time. But the potential for synergy here is, I think, enormous. And what does that synergy look like? It's where the conversation was going yesterday afternoon, is what are the kind of connections that we need to make? What are the communities that need to be talking to each other? How do we get this to be a system-level approach that involves the different groups that are required to make this work? It's more than any one group, organisation, a business industry can take on. And I see this as the three legs of the stool being the regulators. The permits for these offshore wind parks have a clause in them. It's usually the least honoured clause of any of these operations, but at the end of a working life of a wind park, they are to remove all of the infrastructure that's been put in. Cutting off a pylon that holds a 5 or 7 kilowatt wind turbine isn't an insignificant task, but it's actually easy, simple and cheap compared to dredging out all that rock again. That's quite an exercise. So we need to work with the regulators to figure out what the benefit is, quantify that benefit, come up with the metrics that can then form the checklist to say, yes, this has been successful, these habitats have been restored, they are productive, they are net benefit. And that waiving of the decommissioning of the rock should actually provide financial incentive as well. I think there is a lot of the environmental NGOs, the government departments, the basically conservation interests that are already set up to work with industry and with regulators to do this. I've got NORA written there. That stands for the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance. It is already up and going. We formed the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance of Europe and the UK in 2017. It's very active. We've gone from 2 projects, one in Germany and one in England. In 2014, we now have over 30, reaching from the Black Sea, Aegean, Mediterranean, right through the, the North Sea. There are working groups looking at beefing up production so the hatchery production can match the restoration demand in the North Sea. We've got working groups looking at monitoring, we've got working groups looking at disease, we've got working groups looking at public outreach. So there is actually a network that's doing this already set up to kind of collaborate with industry as the partners for the scale of restoration that's required, to work with the regulators to figure out what it looks like and how to check the boxes, what success looks like, what are the metrics for success and how do you measure them, and the potential for this in the North Sea is something that I think we need to capitalise on. We need to get moving on very fast. And the last point I wanted to make was that while the species of oysters, particularly that we have in the US, isn't a deep water species like the one in Europe, it's not an immediately transferable idea to the east coast of the US, but that same concept of the productivity of the habitats that can be created through the wind park operations is actually that net positive impact. That's what we're talking about, and this is just an example of it. So I'd like to set that up to cue in the conversation, I think, for the rest of the panel. We'll talk more about the US.
Excellent. Thank you, Boze. And next we'll be hearing from Laura, who's joining us remotely. So hopefully we have her queued up. There she is. Hi, Laura. All right, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this excellent symposium. I was lucky to join some of the sessions and listen in remotely yesterday, and it's been really given me quite a lot of food for thought already. So I'm just sorry I'm not there in person to have some discussions in the margins. But I've been invited here today to give a perspective on marine net gain policy that we're developing in England. I'm here from the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which is a UK department leading on marine policy, and specifically marine net gain is to apply in England. And we're considering that alongside some wider measures to secure accelerated offshore wind development alongside protection of the marine environment. Next slide, please. So we're developing the policy to deliver net gain in the marine environment, which is an approach to development that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than beforehand. And the policy is being developed in recognition that the state of nature in our country has declined dramatically. The pressure of our demands on habitats have made them degraded and fragmented and led species to the brink of extinction. So marine net gain aims to secure positive outcomes from the environment and reverse some of these longer term trends of biodiversity decline. We recognise that this policy, when designed and delivered well, can secure benefits for nature, people, places and the economy, supporting our net zero goals, sustainable development and protecting biodiversity. And the government has a 25-year environment plan and environmental improvement plan that's driving this implementation of net gain on land and also at sea, and committed to embed these along with other tools and GTs and strategies to put us on the path of nature recovery. In England, nature gain policy isn't new. It's been a requirement in national planning policy on land since 2012. But the Environment Act was brought in to emphasise that this needed to be tightened to enhance delivery and to deliver legislative measures that will implement a mandatory approach to net gain on land later this year. The approach on land uses habitats as a proxy for biodiversity and a metric system to define a target of 10% gain for biodiversity that's required under the Town and Country Planning Act and planning approvals for developments on land. As part of the development of biodiversity net gain on land, there was a recognition that more work is needed to define the approach for the marine environment, and recognising stakeholders' input that a different approach is needed to respond to the kind of unique and dynamic nature of the marine environment to what's being proposed on land. Next slide, please. So recognising the differences between terrestrial and marine environments, we've been taking a kind of first principles approach to marine net gain that builds on the learning of the biodiversity net gain approach on land. And we developed a set of principles that we consulted on to set out what marine net gain is and what it should include in order that we can then move to the next phase of implementation. And these principles have brought together the results of discussions with stakeholders. We've been listening to what some of our excellent scientists have been saying, and industry from experience, to explore how we can best introduce marine net gain in English waters. The consultation set out the aims of net gain policy for the marine environment, broad 9 principles, and we asked for views on whether to mandate net gain for marine developments, the scope of net gain, and how net gain could be applied. Net gain is intended to apply to all marine developments, not just offshore wind, consistent with the approach on land and across all developments through planning and licensing regimes. It's intended to apply it in addition to the mitigation hierarchy that seeks to avoid impacts, the most significant impacts to start off with. And we are proposing a strategic approach to marine net gain to allow contributions at a regional scale and to enhance kind of collaborative opportunities that may achieve better environmental outcomes across multiple developments or off-site, as well as maintain the flexibility for on-site gains where these are environmentally significant. There's a range of options that we've considered are in scope of marine net gain, so that's active restoration, but also recognising that in the marine environment, reduction of pressure will be critical to enhance natural recovery, as well as protecting interventions. So that's considered to be in scope for our policy. And we're considering the range of measures that can be used for delivery. So that includes contributions-based approaches, as well as metrics and assessment frameworks to try and deliver a robust, simple and clear approach that may need to be likely to be iterative is how it's set up. Next slide, please. I think you've seen this concept already at the symposium about the mitigation hierarchy, but marine net gain concept in England is intended to be in addition to this hierarchy, and the existing controls that already exist to assess the environmental impacts of developments and regulate these and avoid and mitigate the most harmful effects. And so marine net gain introduces measures that go beyond no net loss and an additional tool for developments to achieve kind of environmental benefits. Next slide, please. And just to highlight, particularly with offshore wind, that this concept's not operating or intended to operate in isolation. There are some further measures to enhance the use of the mitigation hierarchy and accelerate offshore wind development while enhancing and protecting the marine environment under an offshore wind environmental improvement package. So 2 elements that I've highlighted here are offshore wind environmental standards that seeks to standardise an approach to mitigation for offshore wind, and also strategic compensation that seeks to achieve collaborative approaches and strategic approaches for compensation. Next slide, please. And so this offshore wind environmental improvement package is a part of a package to support the implementation of the British energy security strategy, some really challenging, ambitious targets for offshore wind, and to accelerate the decision making in respect of environmental considerations while also protecting the marine environment, intended to meet both our climate and biodiversity goals. So I highlighted before, particular relevance is the approach to strategic level compensation across multiple projects, and the use of a marine recovery fund as a funding and a delivery mechanism to achieve that strategic compensation, as well as the approach to offshore wind environmental standards that aim to create a consistent approach to mitigating environmental impacts and enable a smoother environmental examination process. Next slide, please. So in addition to that, we will continue to work on developing our marine net gain policy across all developments. We've set out in our consultation the framework of what marine net gain is, and now we need to move towards the not insignificant task of how we will implement this. We want to bring stakeholders with us. We've had some really constructive support and input to the consultation, strong support for marine net gain policy, including on a mandatory basis, but also really strong call about making sure this is simple, clear, and avoiding measures that become an unmanageable burden for development and actually lose the opportunity here for the gains. We're mindful that there's quite a lot of significant interest to achieve this as soon as practical, as well as give certainty to development and establish an approach that's compatible with terrestrial biodiversity net gain on land, recognising most developments at sea will need to cross over into that at some point, so we need to dovetail across the two systems. So we'll need to take a pragmatic approach to how we consider the scope of marine net gain, and it's likely to need to build in more sophistication and understanding and evidence as it grows. We've published our summary of responses and the input we had from stakeholders, and we'll continue to develop the policy and focus on implementation and the legislative powers that we may need for marine net gain, and really want to work onto testing this, sets out some proof of concept projects so we can learn through real world examples and experience to achieve a transparent, proportionate and clear process. We're grateful for the constructive engagement that we've had, and we want to continue to work with our stakeholders and really are learning from examples of where industry have already undertaken this themselves, as well as other stakeholders. And so our continued work is to shape the policy, the legislation, the guidance and the delivery plans to translate these kind of broad aims and shared aims into real benefits to the marine environment. Thank you for letting me talk about this today, and happy to follow up the discussion. Look forward to the discussion of the panel today. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. I hope you could hear your round of applause there. Now we will turn to Atma.
Great. Good morning. It's great to be here. My name is Atma Khalsa. I'm Environmental Affairs Manager at Avangrid. I'm going to save my corporate slides for later, so I don't have to see those twice. I'm going to talk about the project finance and kind of lender policy drivers for this. You heard Neil yesterday talk about PS6, and so that's basically what I'm talking about. Before I joined Offshore Wind, I was a consultant, primarily working in the Global South. This is a project offshore Bangladesh. It was an LNG import project, so there was a vessel offshore that would basically, LNG vessels would come ashore, it would regasify and send natural gas to the grid via subsea pipeline. So this is where the project kind of met the national kind of grid. So you can see the linear mud structure. That's where the state recently kind of put in a pipeline. So I was brought in as a third-party consultant to review their environmental and social impact assessment. The project had already received all the local approvals, but they were getting financing, so they wanted a third-party review. Unfortunately, in that review, we found the impact assessment was lacking, and that the areas shown, the mudflats here, were critical habitat for the critically endangered spoon-billed sandpiper. Pretty cute. Unfortunately, there's less than 500 breeding individuals left. So the company said, okay, can you do a new impact assessment for us to get us ready for financing? So we did. In that process, we were doing stakeholder engagement. We went to go speak with the Minister of Environment, Forestry, and Climate Change, and he said, there are no impacts. This is a project of national importance. And I think that's a real big, a microcosm for doing business in the developing world, where countries are struggling to meet the basic needs of their individuals: water, sanitation, food, housing, clean electricity. And so when a developer comes in and says, I want to spend $1 billion, I want to give you some low-cost electricity, it's hard to say no to that. And so often the environment can take a back seat, which is understandable to some extent, but as we know, I think that's misguided. This is mangrove forest, loosely protected. It was a forestry management area. And so this is really why lender standards were developed. So taking a quick step back, what is project finance? How it works with all these infrastructure projects is there's really a subsidiary company. All the finances are really in this one company for various reasons. And so the monies from that project go back to feed the loan. That's project finance. There are many lenders. The ones I want to talk about briefly are development finance institutions. These are institutions that do business in the Global South. Their main purpose is poverty reduction. You've probably heard of them: Inter-American Development Bank, African Development Bank, the World Bank. The one I want to call out is IFC, and I'll talk about them in a second. And then the commercial lenders, and that's kind of has more relevance to the US here. So Wells Fargo, Citibank, every major bank, actually every major bank in the world except for the Chinese have signed up for Equator Principles, which is an association that says we shall apply lender standards. So they've already signed up and agreed to this global standard. Very briefly, you've probably heard of the World Bank. The World Bank is actually made up of 5 institutions. They have various functions. The International Finance Corporation, or IFC, provides finance to private sector businesses doing business in developing countries. So our Avangrid parent company, Iberdrola, if we wanted to build a wind farm in Vietnam, we could go to IFC for financing. Why is IFC important? IFC has what's called the IFC performance standards. Or their longer name is the Environmental and Social and Sustainability Safeguards, or something like that. Anyway, they're known as the performance standards. They are rules that the clients have to follow in order to get financing. And that is conducted during the finance process. They do a review to make sure that that's happened. But a lot of these things need to happen way earlier to meet those standards. There are 8 of them, as you can see. They are really holistic. They tell you how you should conduct your environmental and social impact assessments. They are very integrated with the social component, more so than EIA, as you hear a lot of. Even though it's in name, it's integrated. These specifically call it out. Particularly in the Global South, there's a lot more social issues related to not having titles for land, not just living in an area without the ability to move on. Anyway, so the standards call out how you do your impact assessments, the process, the screening process to make sure you're not in an area that's of critical habitat, for example. Do scoping, how do you do your stakeholder engagement, the types of environmental and social management systems you need. How do you manage your contractors? How do you prepare for emergency response, et cetera? Indigenous peoples, I just want to mention that one as well, requiring in cases free, prior, and informed consent as this very high bar that I would say is probably above what the US standard is. But the one we really care about is Performance Standard 6 on biodiversity. So PS6 has a requirement, it's fairly simple. There will be no net loss of natural habitat and net gain of critical habitat. So this standard, it's very simple in nature, very difficult to achieve. It's been in place in the Global South since 2006. So really, there's been an ecosystem built around these standards. There are guidance notes. If you have any interest, I'd recommend you go see those. I think there are about 250 pages of thou shalts. It's basically a permit in itself. But they tell you really good information about how do you achieve net positive. So again, this has been happening for a long time. It's in the international realm, a science in itself. So they talk about how to do a baseline, more than 1 year, multiple seasons, et cetera. Doing critical habitat assessments, taking all the specific species that are in an area and seeing if they meet the threshold for critical habitat. And critical habitat is not just for threatened and endangered species. There's a list of other things. So congregatory areas. So is 1% of the population of any species in a location critical habitat. And then there's various others that can apply for their endemic species, range restricted species, et cetera. So after you do your critical habitat assessment, you have a good understanding of what are the things that I need to focus on. What are the key biodiversity indicators that I need to worry about, that I need to integrate in my impact assessment? And then there's other details about how to do mitigation, applying the mitigation hierarchy, all the things we've heard about here today. Offset design, so the business and biodiversity offset program is something that is a set of principles that, again, are integrated into these standards. And then how to do monitoring and evaluation. Lifetime of the project to form an adaptive management approach, et cetera. So again, these are all things, Stephanie Valmuse talked about these yesterday. So again, just to say that this is an ecosystem that's already out there, that's a good standard that we can use as we're trying to meet these goals, and that's already required. Now, I say already required. In the U.S., these are not applied. They are, in the U.S. standards in all high-income OECD countries, they are not required because the banks consider the local legislation to be sufficient. That said, as international corporations, I know we're doing business in Vietnam and the global South generally. Anywhere there's wind, we'll be there. And so what companies have done and what most international companies have done is integrate these into their internal standards. And those are things that you don't see, but we have internal standards of how to do baselines. If we're doing digital aerial surveys, what percent buffer zones, what percent do we need to cover? So the things that we're working on at RWSC are things that we will then integrate to our standards to help have a global, to do business the same way everywhere. And so, again, I just wanted to introduce you to those, and I highly recommend that you go see those. And if you have questions about how to achieve these, there's a lot of resources out there. And again, it's based on international standards, WHO air standards, discharge standards, whatever you need to do to develop a project. They have sector-specific guidelines, and there's a lot of great information that's really available that we can help build on to help us meet those goals locally. Thank you.
Thank you, Atma. All right, Rennie, you're up.
Hello, good morning. So I'm here representing Ørsted. So we're the largest global developer, owner, operator of offshore wind, starting from first offshore wind project in 1991 through the largest offshore wind project in England to Block Island Wind Farm. So stone's throw from here. I'm in the lucky position of getting to say why we've pursued our biodiversity ambition, and my colleague Anthony gets to talk about how and the challenges. So I'm grateful I got to pass the hard work off to him. Let's see. Great. So, I think first and foremost, as a company that's decarbonized and has gone through sort of a transformation from a black to green company, green growth is very much the strategy and the growth strategy for Ørsted's development. So we're at a really exciting and challenging time for the industry as we see growth in the US and internationally. We also see incredible competition and inflationary pricing that is really driving, I think, a lot of changes in the way that we think about the market. And at the same time, that growth means that we're going to be having increased interactions with nature for large-scale deployment. So historically, this has meant that we are building on the mitigation hierarchy, which we've heard about in depth over the past couple of days. I'm really grateful that Laura covered the unique ways in which the UK is sort of building on top of that, which I'll talk about in a second. But in terms of becoming and maintaining a position as a sustainability leader, that means that our mission and responsibility is to help accelerate the green transition in a way that does more than just reducing emissions. And so it's increasingly clear that we can deliver more than reliable, clean energy, and there are lots of different policy frameworks that we're working across, just as Atma's mentioned, in all the different markets in which we have projects or are thinking about pursuing other renewable energy projects that can deliver for society, deliver for nature, and deliver on those items together. So at Ørsted, we've set the ambition that all new renewable energy projects we commission from 2030 on will have that net positive impact on biodiversity. Anthony will talk a little bit more about some of the metrics that the approach we're taking, and we'll have more news to share on that later this year. We want to meaningfully measure biodiversity impact. We want to invest in more ambitious projects, and we want to drive forward the international debate. And so I think just the combination of what we've heard over the past couple of days of doing the right projects collectively at scale, and also doing so in a way that we can develop and communicate with our investors who are in many ways pushing for increased investment and attention on going above and beyond the mitigation hierarchy, which I will, as we've talked about extensively, I think no more elaboration here needed. But for the purpose of our biodiversity ambition, especially for our offshore projects, we're looking at five different target areas of typical impacts that you also see addressed in the mitigation hierarchy: avian, intertidal, benthic, fish, and marine mammals. And one of our challenges as an organization was making sure that we were developing the right projects to build our internal capabilities and capacity, to choose those projects, develop those projects in partnership, make sure that we're doing so with the right principles across all of our markets, as, again, as Atma said, because we have this global purview, making sure that there's alignment across diverse and very differently operating ecosystems, economies, et cetera. So we've sort of evolved and transitioned from the sort of, not just transition, we're building on the mitigation work that we've done. So for our early project mitigations, like using bubble curtains, to trying to make sure that we're actually integrating some ecosystems connectivity and ecosystems enhancement into the way that we build. In 2020, for one of our Borsele projects, which is in the Netherlands, that was about installing cod pipes with local partners, the Rich North Sea and Wageningen University, to do some basic metrics development and measurements on what happens if you install these purpose-built cod pipes within a large-scale offshore wind farm. And once we announced our biodiversity ambition, we started to build out this pilot project portfolio. So a collaboration with WWF to install sort of 3D print the bio huts at the Port of Greno, which is on the Anholt wind farm. We'll talk a little bit about some artificial nesting towers, which are part of our strategic compensation work in the UK, launching our net positive impact biodiversity in late 2021, and then the Recoral project, the 3D printed reef structures, which was another partnership with WWF, and our large-scale Humber restoration project in the UK. We'll have more to share on new projects coming up shortly. But I just wanted to draw a distinction between some of the strategic compensation projects that you might see. So on the left, these are our Kittiwake hotels, which were a $20 million strategic compensation project in the UK. So this is very much meant to target a direct impact and try to mitigate those population level impacts that you might see from a large scale project. But in the same region, adjacent to many of our large wind farms on the eastern seaboard of the UK, which I was really glad to see that Boze had pulled up that historic map of sort of oyster populations and overlaid that with offshore wind farms, we're doing just that. So we've partnered with the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust to do a restoration project involving the restoration of 500,000 oyster reef, native oysters, seagrass and eelgrass restoration, and doing so as in a community partnership. So what's driving private sector action? I think Atma's really well covered the finance piece, but I want to talk a little bit about investor interest, a little bit about the different reporting structures that are currently in place, and blue bonds. So our developers are asking for this. Our developers, many of which are large public pension funds, are thinking about the future of their constituency and the future of the planet. So they want to understand how companies manage their biodiversity interactions, and that's driven by ESG reporting frameworks like the EU taxonomy. So the EU taxonomy is a newly appointed sort of legal requirement that's intended to address greenwashing, which clarifies what suitable technologies for addressing different environmental impacts might be, and establishes a reporting framework. And in addition, you have things like the European Sustainable Reporting Standards. You have the which was developed as part of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. That's the taxonomy. You have other science-based targets for nature organization, an organization that's trying to sort of set new targets for what sort of collective corporate action might look like, create alignment, create sort of shared goals, trying to reach that at-scale impact. The Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, so TNFD. These are all third-party support for setting targets, and that can help with governance, strategy, risk management, and metric development. And finally, on this front, we have an increasing interest in blue bonds. So since 2017, all new Ørsted bonds have been issued in a green bond format and have committed to exclusively deploying long-term green and sustainable financing for our projects. So this makes up for more than 80% of our bond portfolio. Sarah covered this yesterday, the Global Biodiversity Framework. So Target 15 of that framework requires companies to disclose their interactions with nature and take action on those interactions. Within the European context, that very much closely ties to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And then we have the regional policy drivers, which are varied and have a sort of a huge range of approaches to the way that different communities are thinking about addressing biodiversity impact and trying to milk as much out of this opportunity we have in a green transition as possible. And we have the Marine Net Gain Framework in the UK, which has been talked about at length, so I'll skip over this. We have the tender criteria that we see in places like the Netherlands, which will be taken up in, I think, one of the following sessions, but just to say, this is a way of incorporating into the base product that you're acquiring biodiversity or ecologically driven criteria, sort of components. And that means that you can really target what you're looking for as a legislature and as a community for what you're trying to pull out of an offshore wind project. So we've seen multi-factor criteria in the US that are really targeted at supply chain development, for example. And I'm looking forward to hearing what the panel has to say later on today about exactly what will and won't work about using this as a mechanism for driving change within the industry. And just as an aside, there's also proposed legislation in Australia around biodiversity credits, so they're trying to create a nature repair market effectively. And I think that that's something where if you pair that with the blue bond, green bond work that we and many of our competitors are interested in pursuing, I think biodiversity credit schemes is an interesting mechanism for driving increased enhancement in biodiversity. I'll leave the challenges to Anthony, but just to say, there seems to be some misformatting here. It's a complex process to try to invest and develop all these different projects. We're really excited about the project portfolio and embedding this work in the rest of our projects moving forward. We're in a highly cost-constrained environment, and so we need to make these investments in ways that are strategic and effective. We need to manage stakeholder interactions and expectations. Clearly, over the past couple of days, we've seen that there's a bunch of different ways of thinking about what biodiversity and net positive means in offshore wind for the future of the industry. We're in these changing and diverse policy landscapes, and we also have to manage and facilitate coexistence with these projects, which, depending on whether you're doing coastal restoration or if you're trying to do integrated aquaculture, there's a whole range of ideas on the table for what this could mean and look like, but we have to do that in a way that serves as many people as best possible. So just final thoughts from me. Seems like over the past couple of days, we've been thinking through what the best mechanisms are for integration, whether or not that's pooled funds or incorporation into tender criteria. Those are some of the mechanisms we've seen be most effective and drivers for us as an organization. We want to make sure that as we build and develop these projects that we're aligned with corporate or with public targets. So it's critically important that governments identify priority areas and begin to be facilitators of what collective action can be across the public and private sector. And in the process of doing so, whether or not you have a public or privately allocated fund, visibility and transparency is key. So metrics are one tool of doing that. I think if we have sort of pooled funds and collective action, making sure that we have clear targets and metrics, hopefully, that don't drive us too far down the path of madness, but rather help us make sure that we're delivering responsibly, effectively, and in collaboration with local community partners on the ground, universities, tribes, you name it. I think we're looking forward to seeing how this progresses over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30. So thank you.
Thanks, Rennie. All right, our final presentation will be from Drew Carey. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. Oh, thank you. That's helpful. So you can't see this, but there's a clock right in front of me that is ticking down the number of minutes you have left for discussion. So I'm going to make sure that my presentation is available to you with my notes, because I'm probably going to move pretty fast over some parts of it. But I have a couple observations from yesterday that I wanted to squeeze in. First of all, I want to clarify that we actually have a lot of baseline data. 15 years ago, that was not the case, but between state efforts, federal efforts, and the ongoing baseline monitoring that is required for all the projects that are underway, we actually have a tremendous amount of data, more data than at a scale much finer than I've ever seen in my entire career. So we need to be very clear. That's not for every species or every interaction, but we have a tremendous amount of data. Emily keeps getting name checked. See her for the data. So second, the existing process, and by that I mean process of getting renewable energy in the ocean in an environmentally and socially sensitive way, is stalled and in danger. And this is largely due to fears of the unknown. On the one hand, it's the sort of unknown risk to resources. Habitats, protected endangered species, fishing, there's a lot of concern. On the other side, there's a huge risk to the industry because with an unknown process, in other words, timing, unpredictable process, it's very, very difficult to commit resources, sign contracts, that sort of thing. So as things get clogged and stalled, both sides are experiencing a tremendous amount of risk. Are we going to ram this through without consideration, or are we going to delay it? So if there was some threshold of net positive, in whatever way we choose to define and implement it, if this could reduce some of this risk, some of this fear, some of this unknown, then that is a tremendous motivation for exploring this further. Now, net positive will mean something very different to a fisherman, very different to a shearwater, and that's one of the places where I'm going to try to dive in a little bit. So I'm a benthic ecologist, that is, I study the seafloor. I'm also a geologist, so I take a very long view of environments. The group that I work with has spent a tremendous amount of time also on fisheries. So I want to pose a question. What if offshore infrastructure, sorry, I can't read my words here. What if offshore infrastructure delivers enhanced biodiversity on its own for marine systems, but not focal species and populations? So we need to kind of consider that question, and I'm going to run through some stuff here to give you some context. So the other thing I want to say is, from a science perspective, it's critical, and we've already talked about this, to have quantitative means to try to assess what we're talking about in terms of enhancement. But I want to emphasize, I think this is probably clear, enhancement is a concept grounded in social terms. So we're talking about human values here. Nature has lots of synergistic processes established through millennia of adaptive evolution to changing environmental conditions, and it will continue to do so. Our environment is changing much faster at the moment, but in the natural world, judgment of fitness is very harsh. It's generational and with no consideration of human values. So keep that in mind as we think about what do we mean by net gain, net positive, and all that. So when you have an offshore wind structure, whether it's floating or fixed, it is necessarily introducing new habitats to the ocean. So I kind of ask the question, is that enough just on its own for some sort of net positive impact? I think it depends on your perspective. We know quite a lot about the local effects, so I think we actually know a lot about the structures themselves. When they're introduced into the habitat, I think it's very predictable what happens. I'm not going to go through everything here. I'm going to share this with you. What we don't know is the cumulative effects on the very large-scale utility scale wind farms in the United States. We certainly do in Europe, but it's a little different here. So can then the nature of these habitats be enhanced in some way to create more net positive impacts? And we've been talking about this quite a bit. This is a project that we did in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy. We hope to continue it. But I think there is some room here to consider going beyond just simply establishing the structures. So I would argue that the benthic habitats, I have my own perspective, but I think they're the starting point for looking at cumulative impacts to marine ecosystems. And that's because these structures introduce this habitat in a structured way, and then they have cascading effects on the surrounding ecosystem and habitat. Now, there are four main things here. I'm going to run through them super fast. You can come back to them. Most of this is published. Benthic habitat modification. We know a lot about this. We know what happens. We've seen it in Europe. We just saw it at CVOW, which is the Virginia project. We've seen some evidence through rodeo at Block Island as well. Then there's benthic pelagic coupling. This is incredibly important. The thing I want to emphasize here is that unlike most artificial reefs, other than oil rigs and things of that nature, the key here is there's an intertidal component, and that drives a big part of what's occurring in terms of filter feeders and the benthic pelagic coupling. Then there is clearly biomass exported to other habitats. We're starting to begin to figure this out. It's much, much trickier to follow this, but it is where we begin to get into scale and cumulative effects. Another very important concept is connectivity. A simple example, Block Island Wind Farm, when we trawled out there, we never saw any mussels until the wind farm was established, covered with mussels, and now you find mussels a mile away on perfectly suitable habitat. They just didn't happen to be there before. So species that we socially see in positive terms may spread. Species that we see in less positive terms may also spread. So we have to pay attention to that. And then the actual habitat itself, how suitable is it? What species does it favor? What species are affected? There's a huge complex thing going on here, but we definitely need to know the sort of play of that habitat beyond just the structure itself. So I'm going to stop there. My last point will be biodiversity is only one aspect of what I view as net positive gain. I really focus a lot on the function of these habitats, the function of the ecosystem. How do we go about measuring that? I trained as, in taxonomy and kill them and count them, but eventually I didn't feel that answered the kinds of key environmental questions that we need to ask. So we need to move beyond indices, we need to move beyond pure biodiversity and recognize that it delivers other kinds of functions. And I never changed any of my slides. I'm so sorry. All right, you'll just have to download it.
I have an easy one for the scientists. So we're creating structure in areas that are largely sandy bottom. How do you take more biodiversity but different, and in the context of the existing sea users, the fishing community, will it have a positive impact on them? How do you balance that trade-off?
So I'm happy to start with that. I think I touched on this in terms of balance. I wouldn't say that the soft habitats, the mud bottoms, the sand habitats are not important. I would say we have seriously shifted the balance of what's there. And it's why my work has focused on those structured biogenic habitats, because that's what has been lost. And we've measured those loss rates. The oyster reef is a global study. We're less than 10% remaining. Most areas, North Sea that I was describing, less than 1. So it's functionally extinct. And we, evolutionarily have had those structuring habitats in fairly large amounts. So it's ecology, it's all a balance. But where I'm focusing is how do we restore, I think is the only word I can come up with, some of those very productive structured habitats that we've lost.
So I would, of course, I love being a contrarian and arguing with Boze. I would say that is very much a North Sea perspective. I did my PhD in the North Sea. I'm familiar with it. I don't think it applies as clearly to the Northeast Atlantic or even the Gulf of Mexico, although there are some areas there that have been degraded. So I think this balance between what I would think of as mobile contact gear, which can't deal with hangs and rocks and structure, as opposed to other fisheries, important fisheries that are dependent on structure, that even in the Gulf of Mexico, there are 2 major fisheries that are pretty much dividing up the space. And I think we see that in the Northeast with fixed gear and mobile gear. And so being a benthic ecologist as well, I think mud is really valuable, but there is space to increase the structured habitat and then see how it also affects the surrounding habitat. Our evidence suggests that those mud and sand bottoms actually become more productive as a result of that.
Thank you. All right, any others?
Well, I wanted to pick up Drew's question on indices also. I think I wanted to pose to the panel more broadly, do we think that indices are helpful in creating sort of a global approach? Should we even be taking a global approach to what are really functionally regional habitats and local habitats?
Well, we've had this discussion a few times. I think there are, not all indices are created equal. There are some that have proven to be very valuable. I think that there is the driver of global policy, the need to have a number. Let's boil this down to a 5-point scale and make a decision. I understand those pressures. I think and we have developed indices that have proven useful, I think they need to be very carefully vetted. In essence, how predictive are they of the desired outcome or less than desired outcome? It's hard to have time to test them. That's the real problem. Yeah.
And if I could add, it's a great question. I think it is critical to consider the level at which those indices are being applied. In a science perspective, at a project level, the metrics are complicated because you want to discover, you want to see into some fairly complex relationships. The further up the chain of command that you go, right to the level of the nationally determined contributions, the simpler those metrics need to get, because they are trying to incorporate more and more of that project level diversity. So it's essential that the top order metrics are simple, and where we are, kind of what level we're considering those metrics is really important.
I totally agree. I think the national capital, natural capital approach also, I'm curious to see over the course of how our conversations evolve after this event, whether or not those are appropriate ways of thinking about the value of the action that we're taking bare minimum, and pairing that with the appropriate indices, given that there are so many national scale efforts in places like Australia and places like the US to robustly encapsulate and incorporate natural capital into GDP.
Great. I want to make sure Laura can jump in as well. Would you like to weigh in on that question or ask a question of your fellow panelists?
I can come back on that question. I guess reflect on some of the feedback we had during our consultation on kind of metrics and things. I mean, something that was coming through was the need for kind of clarity. And if this implemented as part of a development decision, I think to avoid uncertainty about, when is net gain achieved, what is enough, and what the requirements are for a developer. So I think there's a need for some kind of framework. If you take it out entirely, it does actually potentially make the system actually more complicated. So there were some concerns about if you entirely decouple some of the approaches to how you might assess impacts to delivering net gain, that could cause more complexity. So there's a bit of a middle ground I think we were finding in terms of a truly hands-off approach and some of the metrics that could maybe actually enable delivery.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Another one for the scientists. Free consulting support. NPI is an impact-driven framework. Given these projects are so resource constrained, would it be best to utilize those funds closer to shore, totally unrelated to impacts in areas that are having the highest return on investment, that are, again, species, not the species that we're impacting, but it's just beneficial for society?
I'll take the first one, let Boze contradict me. I was thinking about this yesterday, that there was some very, very compelling evidence that for some species, these focal species, marine mammals, birds, for God's sake, put a fund together and go to the South Atlantic and protect these nesting sites. It makes complete sense to me. Disconnected, it's not project specific, but here's an opportunity to really do that off-site stuff. I think that can be worked. In the context of the project scale, there's been a lot of talk about this. Again, I think scientifically we all agree it really needs to be addressed at a regional scale. It's taking time to come to consensus about what to do, but we have made, I think, quite a bit of progress in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I could only agree. Absolutely. Sorry.
Oh.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. You know, you're talking migratory species, even for the fish. I mean, working on the different life history stages. If the offshore kind of wind environment is more forage habitat for older year classes of fish, where are the babies coming from, and what should be done for those juvenile fish habitats, and how does that connect to the offshore? It's a system scale level of thinking, as was stressed yesterday, and we need to incorporate that system scale into what we're considering.
So, hi, Mel Austin from University of Plymouth again. I'm going to do what was done to us yesterday on the panel and say to each of the panelists, you know, I'm hearing, I could have written a little matrix of which stakeholder you're most scared of that you need to communicate with. And actually, I'd argue that metrics are a way of communication, and maybe they're not the right one. But, you know, obviously, Drew and Boze are scared of each other. But, you know, I heard investors, I heard fishers, I heard regulators might be worried about developers. Developers might be worried about regulators. You know, is there something about crashing through this that if you actually all thought about who you're most scared of and how you deal with that, that you might actually learn how to progress the industry and development?
All right, I'll dive in. I guess I sort of posed the question, so thanks for coming back on that. I think when I spoke in terms of the stalled situation, that is largely a challenge of, I think, assurance that critical habitats and threatened and endangered species are fully accounted for in the design and implementation of offshore projects. Scientifically, I'm convinced that there is a buffer of protection associated with that, but we're not seeing consensus or concordance even across regulatory agencies. So that's the one that I would identify right now.
This is such a hard question. I think one of the things that I find most compelling about the work that we're trying to do is that we're trying to make investments in projects that that currently we're not being asked to do in the regulatory framework, but that we think are valuable, that we think provide ecological connectivity or provide support to juvenile or benthic habitat species that enable the compensation work that we're doing to be successful. And so I think the thing that I'm hoping for is that we come to a consensus around what those additional enabling actions are going to be that help deliver on what I think the collective, I'm an anthropologist, the collective imaginary of what offshore wind can be for us as a larger community. So I'm hopeful from the biodiversity perspective that we're able to do that in a way that satisfies people, either from the regulatory perspective, but also from the indigenous, coastal community perspective of folks who have a really unique emotional and personal connection to place. And that's what I'm excited about for at least at this point in time for the program, the flexibility that we have to say what are the right investments that we think will help bring people in to the work.
Yeah, I don't know if afraid is the right term, but the fishing community, we're messing with their livelihoods, and whether they're real or perceived impacts, we can talk about adding structure as much as we want, and it's just going to sound like more impact. So That's really, I think, the key challenge to offshore wind. And it is a grand experiment. I'm an ecologist. I think it's going to create more biodiversity, more productivity, healthier ecosystems. I think you've seen a lot of that in science with marine protected areas. But, you know, it's before they're built, and this is the time where people are, you know, sounding their voices, and they won't, you know, be able to feel the impacts until they're actually there. And so hopefully we do our best to minimize those. And a lot of work to do. It's a really hard challenge.
And contrary to popular opinion, I think we have consensus. I'm an optimist. I actually see the connections between regulators, industry, the conservation groups. I see the potential for working together as being tangible right in front of us. It's actually really exciting. And I would reiterate that if fear were a word that I kind of considered, it would be the fishing industry. I consider them to be, you know, probably most under threat and therefore most offensive and difficult to work with. But there's incredible potential for actually benefiting the fishing industry through what we're doing. So I would love to be able to bring them better into the conversation.
Laura, would you like to jump in?
Thanks. I guess I think what's unique about this, and it's a rare bit of policy where actually everyone seems to be in agreement and supportive of it across quite a range of different, you know, maybe historically different views. That's really positive. I guess the fear is around actually then doing it. And, you know, there's huge ambition. There's really a lot of really good positive will for this to be a win-win. So I think it's about just making it happen. And, you know, making sure the burdens are distributed correctly, because I think that's where things will, you know, maybe the agreement will change depending on how it's implemented.
Great, thank you. Do we take Emily's? Great.
Yeah, I have a question. My name is Holly Goyert with Biodiversity Research Institute, and my question is probably directed mostly at Atma and Rennie, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists. It has to do with foreign countries that have almost a complete lack of baseline data where their governments are getting up to speed with offshore wind, as are the rest of us, but on top of that, we have these financial performance standards. And so my question has to do with the country-specific terms of reference that may be changing, how to reconcile those with financial performance standards, and basically, does it mean meeting the minimums, or is this a place where net positive plays a role to basically go above and beyond and prepare for potential future regulatory change?
Great, thank you. Everyone's looking at Atma.
It's a great question. I think that one I'm going to punt on a little bit to Atma because I'm not really in the weeds of the financing piece per se. I will say I don't think the approach is necessarily to create uniformity across every single regulatory regime that you're looking at. Because I think there is ultimately going to be an immense amount of nuance to the way that you want and need to develop offshore wind in your region, and the way that intersects with the larger energy infrastructure and energy economy that you have in places like from Vietnam to Australia, right? I think there's sort of a huge range in difference even within the Asia-Pacific region for how they structure their energy markets and what is deemed feasible even outside of the biodiversity context.
Hard question. Baseline data in developing countries is probably the #1 challenge with everything. And so identifying those key factors early to try to do your best. An impact assessment is not PhDs. It's what's enough information to adequately assess the impacts and determining what mitigation monitoring is required. I think as an offshore wind industry, what I'm seeing with birds in particular, but also other species that are highly migratory, is let's work together. We're working with our partner company in Brazil to mitigate bird impacts. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there. And let's work together. The tags, our data is data, and if we have it here, let's just work together to make sure we're sharing it appropriately. Mm-hmm. So I would love to know, particularly for the regulators, I know the oil and gas industry has the International Regulatory Forum, which is how do regulators work across the oil and gas industry. It would be love to kind of expand on that for wind and think strategically and big picture about the key species that are important and where there are areas that we can share information most efficiently.